Kate, I believe, is a project manager there, and we've worked together for about a year, and I've really appreciated getting to know Kate. And I think today I'll just say too, as you've noted, internet connectivity. I mean, if only Elon Musk got those satellites up a little bit quicker, hey, that one, then we'd all be fine across everywhere. But we do have a few issues. So if Kate's video isn't working or if there's a slight delay, just please bear with us. I think we've all experienced that. So Kate, feel no concern at all. We're a friendly group here. So so welcome, and please go ahead.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound good.
Okay, I'll go into my next slide and just let me know if there's a lag or if I need to slow down or anything. You don't mind?
Sure, yeah, we will.
Do you see the next slide?
Not yet, but you know, it adds sort of a suspenseful excitement to the morning, so it'll be fine.
Okay, well, the next slide as it comes up is just the agenda of the presentation this morning. I'm going to start with a brief introduction of who I am and a bit of a background to CIER and the work that we do. I'm going to break down the projects that we do in the Prairie region and have completed within this last year into three main topics, being biodiversity, climate change, and land management. So a little bit about me. I'm originally from Toronto, but I now live on the unceded traditional territories of the Silcotin and Northern Chipewyan communities in Williams Lake, British Columbia. If you're familiar with British Columbia, I'm smack dab in the middle of it, right in the interior there. It's beautiful. I am a project manager with CIER. John was correct. I mostly oversee the Prairies, Pacific, and Northern territories in the projects that I work on. I know a few of you on the call today, so nice to see you again. Professionally, I am a wildlife ecologist. I did attend and graduated from the University of Toronto and then received 2 advanced diplomas from Fleming College, the School of Environmental and Natural Resource Sciences in Lindsay, Ontario. Prior to this position at CIER, I worked as Natural Resources Manager at the Northern Shuswap Tribal Council here in Williams Lake. And prior to that, I worked as Referrals Coordinator at Hatfield First Nation, just north of Williams Lake. So just a bit of background, as I said, about CIER. The CIER, CIER, stands for the Center of Indigenous Environmental Resources. We were founded in 1995 by 10 First Nations chiefs from across Canada, and we're Canada's first Indigenous-directed environmental nonprofit charitable organization. So CIER supports Indigenous people and communities to be leaders of positive environmental change, using the best of Western and Indigenous knowledge to create a world that is in balance and supports the well-being of all living things. And since 1995, CIER has worked on 450 projects with over 300 Indigenous nations across Canada. We are a completely virtual organization with staff here in BC, Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec. The first project I'm going to jump into falls under the biodiversity heading, and it's also the biggest project that I am currently involved in. It is the Species at Risk Act, or SARA, Consultation, Cooperation, and Accommodation National Project. So the multi-year project facilitates Indigenous communities and organizations' participation in Environment Climate Change Canada, Canadian Wildlife Service listing, and recovery planning processes for terrestrial species at risk as part of implementation of the Federal Species at Risk Act. So each region has focused their resources on an area of study and development, as you see on the slide there, hopefully, that maximizes efforts for each species. In the Prairie region specifically, we have been doing quite a bit of work on wolverine, grizzly bear. Actually, just yesterday, we did a workshop on prairie rattlesnake, and we are in discussion about potential listing of plains bison as species at risk. So the key activities that we do for these SRACA, as we call it, workshops, we hold CIER 101 and Batch 19 workshops. And CIER 101 being workshops where we go over the basic steps of what the Species at Risk Act is. And the Batch 19 workshops are explaining how we got to where we are now, how those species that we are going to be talking about were listed originally, and where we plan to move in the future with the Indigenous engagement that we receive. We also have in-depth target sessions for specific species, but we also do some focus on the ecosystem at large. And we also hold training sessions. We also oversee expression of interest and capacity support funding applications. These come in the form of project support, either to hire a contractor or to provide support within the Indigenous communities themselves to participate in projects. We really like to focus on building community capacity. So we really like to fund those projects that really help the community grow and support their rights and title. So we also, after every year, we do a reporting and project evaluation. Right now it's ongoing. The Species at Risk Act project has now been extended for another 3 years. And so we are going to be coming out with more reports over the next 3 years, at least. So at the CIER virtual workshops, again, CIER being Species at Risk Act, we have one-on-one meetings if requested. We can have these meetings with individual Indigenous communities to discuss recovery planning for the terrestrial species at risk, or we can do group sessions. In the prairies, we have divided the provinces into various sections and also separated First Nation community sessions from Métis sessions based on the different geographical location and to represent the diversity of the Indigenous peoples within the 3 provinces. So as I said earlier, in the CIER 101, we basically talked about the Species at Risk Act project and the process and how we arrived there. We also support the expression of interest, so that's projects within individual communities. Batch 19 workshops, pre-listing consultation, explaining how we arrived at the species that we are going to be looking at. And then we have in-depth sessions on targeted species, and then the capacity building, funding, and training for land managers as well. So in terms of funding support, we provide participant fees for attendance at all of these workshops to help cover the time for community members, staff, and elders and knowledge holders to attend these workshops. We want to thank them for their time. We realize it takes away from their ability to work for those few hours, sometimes a full day workshop. So we want to give them back some of the money for that time. And again, we also provide funding through the capacity requests and expression of interest. In terms of reporting and project evaluation, for reporting, we develop and share workshop summary participant reports, and we update materials on our CIER website. And we also provide these workshops to the communities that we work with to help support in future planning for whatever project that they've decided to work on. We also provide support through project evaluation, and we undertake a set of targeted interviews with various Indigenous representatives who participated in multiple project activities to learn how we can improve the process in the future. So about the SRACA project, if anyone here has attended any of the SRACA workshops, you may have heard this language before, but CIER is supporting Indigenous communities and organizations and ECCC in their collaborative work on federal listing and recovery planning for terrestrial species at risk, like providing information and sharing knowledge and language of SARA and SAR through workshops and other events. Support capacity and skills development to incorporate SAR and SARA considerations in land use planning, management, and stewardship. And we like to enhance opportunities for Indigenous nations to contribute meaningfully to listing and recovery planning. And again, we provide funding for Indigenous nations to lead targeted recovery actions within their communities that are focused on species at risk within the legislative framework of the SRAC. It is in the species-specific workshops that we use graphic recording to help record and tell the story of the discussions that take place. It has proven to be a valuable tool. We wanted to share with others and ensure that there are people in each region that can do graphic recording. Essentially, we received funding to support Indigenous individuals from across Canada to take graphic recording training. And I can say, as of this morning, I just discovered that several of those who underwent that training are now hired within their communities. So we're really happy that we provided that support. And this next slide here, hopefully it comes up for you, is an example of a graphic recording. On all of our Soraka project workshops, we have a graphic recorder professionally, but we are also now working with community members so they can get their practice in doing the graphic recording so they can be hired within their communities and elsewhere. So now I'm moving on to biodiversity. This is a project that was completed by my coworker, so I wasn't actually directly involved in this project, but I wanted to share it as it was what we think was quite successful in the Prairie region, and that is the Pollinators Project. So we started with a simple presentation designed for children on what is pollination. And as you can see, the format on these slides here are a little more user-friendly. These are taken directly from the projects themselves and the presentation itself to be child-friendly. In all of the work we do like to acknowledge the Indigenous communities and the location in which we are located and where the project is taking place. So in that pollinator project, they included a legend retold by an Indigenous community member. I believe this was near Sandy Bay, Manitoba. So here are some more slides that were shown to children to make the pollination process more accessible. They also created workbooks in which children were allowed to take home with them and figure out what foods do I like that are where pollinators are required so that I can eat that food, you know, on a children's level. So here are a few pages from that Indigenous Pollinator Protector Workbook as an example. So the next project I would like to speak to under biodiversity, and I know some of you on this call are familiar with this and are involved, is the Central Grasslands and Wildlife Health Project. As you can see on the image here, all of the yellow dots there are band office locations or nation offices locations for which we sent invitations for participants to attend the workshops. Originally, the Central Grasslands Roadmap only included Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, but I noted that there are several grassland communities in BC and many communities that rely on that grassland area. So this project extended to include BC. So it was a two-part workshop. In the first, participants were invited to share their voices on what grasslands mean to them in relation to any grassland type, any grassland species or community, or any other aspect. The second workshop was designed to respond to questions and comments received at the first session through presentations and discussions on the key themes. One of the activities we like to do during our Teams workshops or our Zoom workshops is a word cloud. If you're unfamiliar with the word cloud, people input answers online or through text or through the chat box, answers to the question that is posed. And the more times the specific word is listed, the larger it gets on the screen. So after the first workshop, we discovered that the themes of bison rematriation, particularly habitat restoration through cultural programming, linking cultural herds, and political issues, including the classification of bison and cultural herds as livestock, and the Buffalo Treaty were of key interest to the participants. We also discovered food sovereignty, including community food security programs and community gardens, was also of interest. Wildlife health and human health, including community safety and diseases such as chronic wasting disease, also was of interest. And the Indigenous conservation, of what the word conservation means for Indigenous communities and the diversity of Indigenous communities across the large region in which we work. So those four key themes, bison rematriation, food sovereignty, wildlife health and human health, and Indigenous conservation, are the four key themes that we brought into the second workshop. Here's an example of another graphic recording. This one was done by one of our professionals, but we did have a student sit in as well. So as you can see, they identify bison rematriation, connectivity, cultural bison herds, and barriers to as designation as livestock or wildlife as key themes. Also discussed was the Buffalo Treaty, wildlife health and human health, including community programming to tackle diseases such as chronic wasting disease, food sovereignty, community gardens, and the concept of conservation. On another note, after we receive the final copy of every graphic recording, we do send it to all of the participants from every workshop for their review and approval before we share anything online or on our website. So now I'm going to move into the topic of climate change. This is another project that I was not involved in, but I'm very happy to share on behalf of my coworkers. And that was their participation in the Earth Rangers program. Some of you may already be familiar with Earth Rangers, but if not, they're a conservation organization committed to educating and engaging youth across the country. Their goal is to instill environmental knowledge, positivity, and confidence to take action against climate change. They're working to inspire youth across the country to adopt sustainable behaviors and become conservationists in their own communities. And show an example. So again, this was made in a child-friendly format because Earth Rangers is designed to work for the youth audience. I don't think we have time for that video, especially with the connection right now. So here's an example of what was discussed during the workshop. The question of what contributes to climate change in Canada was posed, and what we heard from the Earth Rangers, the youth participants, about oil and gas, transportation, waste, industry, buildings, and agriculture contribute to climate change. They also asked the students to give everyday examples of what contributes to climate change, like driving a car, for example, keeping your lights on, etc. That leads into the effects of climate change in your region. So again, you can see that we adopted this workshop to be more for a youth audience than an adult or professional audience. We also like to point out animals affected by climate change. We find it quite successful to teach climate change action work with youth if you connect it with certain animals and certain species. We see this particularly in Canada. We focused here on the woodland caribou, the narwhal, the polar bear, frogs, and monarch butterflies. We see a bumblebee there as well. Another project that I am working on currently is the climate change project of the Lake Ice Project. It's occurring in the Island Lake community of Manitoba, and it's particularly with the St. Teresa Point and the Wasaga First Nations. So we know that winter roads are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, as lake ice conditions are becoming increasingly variable and unpredictable as a result of warmer winters. So this spurred interest in this project. We discovered that many community members can no longer take the same routes that they had for hundreds of thousands of years due to changing ice conditions, and those routes are no longer safe in the winter, potentially due to climate change. We discovered that winter roads are particularly important for many remote Indigenous communities who rely on them for the transportation of food, fuel, building materials, and other supplies to and from the community. We discovered that it is becoming increasingly necessary to monitor lake ice conditions so that the community can better understand where the hazards exist and if and how they change over the winter and spring months so that the risk of encountering a hazard can be reduced and/or avoided. As you can see in the picture here, we created a map and we went to the two communities and asked community members, hunters and gatherers, elders, knowledge keepers, students, and the general community members to draw on the maps a general idea of the routes that they take when they are in transportation mode or hunting or gathering, or just basically the general routes that they take. We did not ask for specific information such as good hunting spots, for instance, because that's important and confidential to the community. We just asked for general information to help us guide the program. So the information that we received from the community members is put into a database, and then we just take that information and determine what the most traveled routes are. We are working with a geophysicist who is using satellite data to track changing freshwater lake ice conditions in real time. So they are able to see on an app, and now thanks to Starlink, the community members have internet access. They're able to see in real time the safety and stability of the ice and will help ideally provide a better idea of where to travel during that day at any given time for personal safety. So we did focus on increasing knowledge and understanding of the winter lake ice conditions in the Island Lakes communities and how climate change will exacerbate these issues. I have personally traveled up there twice. Both times were extremely rewarding and eye-opening for me. I'd never visited remote communities before to that extent. Wonderful experiences, and we're going to keep going with this project and work with the community members and train them on how to do lake ice probing themselves and how to determine ice safety on their own once our project is completed. Here's a picture. I'm actually on the far right. This was taken actually at the beginning of March, so just about a month ago. As you can see, we're standing on the ice road itself. Beside me in the middle there is a CIER coworker named Anita. And on the far left there is the elder that we hired and providing support to as our community coordinator in the community. And we are very happy that he has stayed on for several years now, supporting us. Just a few more pictures. You can see on the left there, we're speaking to a community member and determining ice road routes. And on the far right there, you can see I'm looking at the winter ice road conditions. I personally, before this trip, had no idea how to read ice from looking at it, but now I have, I think, a little bit of a better idea. So the last project I'm going to talk about is under land management, and that's the Collaborative Leadership Initiative. So it's a shared governance table that was established in 2017. An intergovernmental MOU, or Memorandum of Understanding, was signed in 2019 by 28 First Nations and municipal elected leaders, with 3 shared priorities of the protection of freshwater resources, waste management, and economic development and good jobs for all. So the CLI is a partnership between CIER, Winnipeg Metropolitan Region, and the Southern Chiefs Organization. We've been supported from very early on, and the support has been instrumental in the success of CLI. Funding supports a whole range of CLI activities, including leadership meetings, communications, etc. One of the most recent programs has been the LWBP grant for natural infrastructure projects. It really focuses on building natural infrastructure, as I mentioned. CIER has generally been focused on the 3 community-led projects, which are small in scale and innovative. The objectives are to leverage nature-based solutions and improving water quality while achieving a range of co-benefits. And it also includes building blocks for broader regional efforts. And here are the 3 projects that are occurring in Manitoba. They're in the rural municipality of Osler, the Sky King First Nation, and the village of Dunatar. You can see that the projects are very different from each other, different geographical areas, different focus. First is on biomass harvesting, that's in the rural municipality of Osler. And Sky King was on shoreline regrading and tree planting. And in the village, it was duckweed growth and harvesting in the lagoon for nutrient reduction and use experimentation. I also like to keep in mind that we do work and hire community members from these regions to participate and work in these projects. So I just wanted to say, I know I'm getting pretty close to time. I want to thank you all for listening today. Apologies about my internet connectivity. Where I live is quite rural, so sometimes it's not always the most reliable. Please go to our website at yourcier.org. We do post information about all of our upcoming webinars, and you can find information about many of our projects on there as well. We are also found on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And if you'd like to contact me specifically, my email is khewitt@yourcier.org. Make sure you have the R in yourcier.org. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for listening, and I'd love to answer any questions that you may have. John?
Sure. Thank you so much, Kate. And we can either do a formal round of applause, or you can do the little emoji clapping if you like. But but thank you so much for your presentation this morning, and for the fascinating overview of the excellent projects that you and your team and organization have been doing across the Prairie region. I'm sure that sort of this brought up some questions for some of us that we might have, and sometimes it takes a little while to get warmed up into questions, but I'll open it up now. And yeah, does anyone have anything you'd like to ask of Kate? And Kate, you're welcome to put your video on if you want to, play with fire in that way, or keep it.
I will try. Let me know if it's working clearly or not. Am I blurry still?
You look good. You look good here.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah. So I think it'll be fine.
No.
So yeah, feel free to unmute, folks, if you'd like questions, or yeah, I see Susie Miller. You have a question?
Sorry, I just have trouble with Teams, finding out how to turn it on. Thank you so much. Kate, I'm part of a group that has been working on a core planning team. I noticed there's some other members on it that are on this as well. And one of the things that we have undertaken as part of that is a lot of discussions with Indigenous communities and how to deal with Indigenous communities. How did you learn? I mean, you've obviously had a lot of success and probably didn't gain that in Toronto. So did you use professional advice? Did you have a trusted advisor in the Indigenous communities? Was it trial and error? I'd be really interested in hearing about your experience.
Hey, Sid.
Well, thank you, Susie. It is actually all of the above. You're right. I didn't receive a lot in Toronto, but my grandmother actually was the first Caucasian female to work for the AFN, and she wrote the precursor to UNDRIP, and I'm very proud to say that. And so I grew up learning a lot from her as she worked alongside, and her best friend was former Chief of First Nations Ovid Mercredi. So they worked very closely together, and I was exposed to a lot of various Indigenous cultures across Ontario as a child. I also lived in Elk Island National Park outside of Edmonton for a few years, and really got to experience some of the culture around there, particularly with the Blackfoot. And here in BC, I think the most valuable experience for me was when I worked on reserve. And for me, it was such a 180 difference of how I had been raised and taught in Western science. And it was probably the biggest learning curve of my life is transferring, and like, actually, I don't know everything. And what I was taught is not necessarily the only way of thinking. So working on reserve and being surrounded by lovely, lovely, welcoming elders who were willing to teach me. And I also sit on the First Nations BC Wildlife Habitat Conservation Forum. You may be familiar with the Together for Wildlife strategy. So I helped co-draft that with the assistance of Indigenous communities across BC. And now I just have amazing connections from workshops. I see a lot of people on here that I've met, like Christian Artuzo, through the various projects that I work on at CIER, and just that network gets spread. And now that we're allowed to travel in person a little more now, I'm getting out to more communities. Just last week I was in Brandon, for instance.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That's really interesting. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Susie, and thanks, Kate. Yeah, I think for myself also as a Caucasian white settler scientist, a lot of my work with Indigenous communities, just learning how to be quiet has been my biggest challenge, possibly. Lots of things. So yeah, thanks for sharing, Kate. That's really good. I see Christian Artuzo said, hi, Kate. So Christian, that's also an opening towards a question that probably you have. So go for it.
Hi, Christian.
Hello. Well, I have many questions. I'm just acknowledging Kate for mentioning me there, and it's been a real honor to work on these projects together with Kate and all of the CIER team. So I have lots of chance to ask Kate questions. So I guess my one question, Kate, is for you, what's been most motivating in all of that, or where have you had moments of feeling like, genuine progress or genuine inspiration? What personally, where like you've so many projects, but any particular moments that have stood out to you?
Very good question, Christian. My mind immediately goes to a community on Vancouver Island. They used our capacity funding through the Soraka project to do a report on why the salmon weren't in their communities as much as they had been. They had seen hundreds every year, and then in that one year, they were down to 27 for the entire community. The wildlife, like the grizzly bears, who they considered part of their family as well, they were starving too. So they used our funding to help do a big study into what's happening with aquaculture in that area. And this is at the northwest side of Vancouver Island. And so they put together this report, and it was so well done that they were able to put it forward and then secure that land to be protected as an IPCA, or an Indigenous preserved or protected and conserved area. So they have now successfully taken that land back from previous ownership, and it's now theirs again completely. So some of the first things they did was to close down the fish farms and the prawn fisheries that were within their riparian area, to see if that's going to make an impact on the aquaculture in the area. And they invited me down, and I was very, very honored to be there with the chief, and they had a celebration on the land. Totally poured, rained the whole time. You could tell I wasn't from the coast. I was freezing. But it was so lovely to be a part of that celebration, that land was theirs again. And well, officially it always had been, but legally back, you know what I'm trying to say. So to be a part of something so special, just from something simple like helping through the funding process. And particularly my love of wildlife. I love that I can bring my love of wildlife together with my interest in people and supporting people.
Right. Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Christian, for that question.
Is that available on a website anywhere, Kate? Just a quick follow-up there. Sorry, John. Is there
Sorry, on
any,
that particular one?
yeah, that particular one, is there any sort of easy link just to that summarizes that story?
I think I may have put it in one of our newsletters. I can
Yeah.
see if I can try to find something.
Yeah, cool.
Are there any other questions? As you're all thinking, and I know you are, maybe I can pose one. So, Kate, we're the host organization of this is the Prairie Habitat Joint Venture, and you know the key is in the name, prairies, and a unique, possibly unique characterization of a lot of the prairie and the prairie parkland landscape is a lot more sort of private ownership of land. Especially with agricultural communities, farming communities, of which I grew up in and I'm a part of. With a national organization like CIER, you have experience across different landscapes and sort of ecoregions of the country. What are some challenges you might have experienced, or you as an organization have experienced from an Indigenous perspective? So what are sort of challenges or opportunities to work in this landscape that is so, in some ways, different, than sort of the Northern Boreal or the coastal or the mountainous regions or the Shield? Yeah, just some thoughts on that? Because I think all of us in this call, or most people on this call, are situated relatively within that prairie region. And we're all seeking ways to figure out how do we balance conservation with these, different stakeholder groups. So any thoughts would be welcome.
Okay, absolutely. Probably the biggest thing I hear from the Indigenous communities I work with in the prairies is how overloaded they are with the number of referrals that come in and the engagement fatigue that they have because of the lack of capacity. And a big question is, why are we being asked to engage on a national level and a provincial level on the same projects, particularly in this case, species at risk? And I have asked both federal government and the provincial leads from each of these provinces, like how do we appropriately explain that in a way that we are being respectful of the process, but also can answer those questions for community members. And everyone I've spoken to has so far not had anything for me to share. They're figuring it out themselves. So sometimes bridging the gap and when there's differences like between terrestrial, like we're supporting terrestrial funding, but there's aquatic species, and then realizing many Indigenous cultures believe that everything is interconnected and you can't separate the species approach, but they're mandated under different legislation. Like that can be very, very challenging. Especially, I know you're talking about prairie, but especially in BC, a big one that comes to my mind is like grizzly bear and salmon. When salmon is under Department of Fisheries and Oceans and grizzly bear is under the provincial and federal legislation of Species at Risk Act, right? So most of the problems are just trying to maneuver through these different trajectories. And when each organization has their own processes, and we realize the people that you're speaking to aren't the decision makers, so they can only pass along the information that they know, and we respect that. I think that's probably the biggest thing is just trying to be as helpful as possible with how the system is now.
Right. Yeah, and not become just completely burnt out from all the effort.
Exactly. And really trying to spread the awareness that communities generally, not all of them, are often underfunded, don't have the human capacity and the resources to reply to all of these requests for engagement. And in some provinces, it's assumed consent if you don't reply to a referral within that time period of 30 or 60 days. Doesn't mean that community is okay with that. It just means that maybe they just haven't been able to put the time and effort into another application that has come in. So again, it is tough because provincial and federal is so different.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And that's really a good reminder for all of us too, to sort of act in humility as we reach out to and understand that capacity and then the time, just the different approaches, that we have.
And making sure that engagement is meaningful and not just a checkbox because government says you have to engage with Indigenous people, but we say meaningfully engage.
Yeah.
That's key.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Sorry to monopolize time here. Well, I won't go through the list and start naming names and say, hey, ask a question. I'll save that for the classroom. It's more fun there anyway. But I just want to thank all of you for attending this morning. And of course, Kate gave her contact information, but if you didn't catch that, you can feel free to contact me. I bombard you with enough emails that I'm sure you have me in your inbox. And yes, thank you, Kate. Thank you so much for your time and for the work that you do and for the work that CIER does and the various Indigenous communities across the country that you represent and work with. So thank you.
Thank
And
you. I'd also like to note those aren't the only projects that we work on in Prairie. Like I was saying, when I just got back from Brandon, we're working on the Southwest Manitoba Priority Place Mixed Grass Prairie Initiative. We funded Indigenous community members to visit the Prairie Conservation Endangered Species Conference in Calgary in February. So there are many things that are going on. We just didn't have all of the time to go through everything.
Yeah, no, thank you. It was a great snapshot. So yeah, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for coming. And I encourage you next month, we're taking a slight shift and we'll be exploring regenerative and sustainable agriculture. So slight pivot, to use a popular word these days. So anyway, thank you, Kate. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everybody.